Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Nature Live Online. I'm Alison. I'm your host for today's talk. Now, hopefully some of you have been following our previous talks, but if you're new to Nature Live, we're an event that usually happens every week in the Natural History Museum in London. We're a chance for our visitors to actually meet and speak with some of our scientific staff, find out what they do behind the scenes at the museum. Now, of course, we can't safely be at the museum right now. So instead, we've brought Nature Live online. So we're going to be bringing our science and our scientists direct from our homes to yours. In a minute, I'm going to be joined by Natalie Cooper, and we're going to be finding out a little bit more about our famous blue whale skeleton, Hope. Now, I've got lots of questions for Natalie, and I can see already that many of you have been posting your questions as well. We've got absolutely loads. That's fantastic. What we'll do is we'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can during the stream. Do bear with us, but let's meet our scientist. Natalie, are you there, Nat?
Yep. Hi, good morning.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Now, let's start by finding out what you do at the museum, first of all.
Hi, so I'm a researcher at the museum. So I work in the vertebrates group, which means I work on mammals, I work on birds, I work on reptiles, amphibians, and also fishes. So I get to work with lots of weird and wonderful specimens and learn lots of exciting things.
That's brilliant, a little bit of everything almost. But it's one specimen that we're today, isn't it? It's our blue whale, Hope, now famously hanging in Hintze Hall. Why did the museum take the decision to put this specimen right at the heart of the museum?
Well, hundreds of years ago, there were lots and lots of these big whales, including blue whales in our oceans. And unfortunately, humans then started hunting them, and we hunted them almost to extinction. So in the 1960s, a bunch of people got together from different countries around the world and decided that they would actually try and protect blue whales. So they banned blue whale hunting. And this was the first time that lots of people from different countries came together to protect one species. And it was successful. So blue whales, they're still endangered, but they're not extinct, which is great. And the museum thought it would be really good to have something really positive to remind people that when we work together, we can actually protect animals, but also to remind us that as humans, we do have a responsibility to try and take care of animals in the natural world.
Absolutely, and it's a really powerful message, and it's the reason we called her Hope, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, tell us a little bit about blue whales in general. What do we know about these amazing animals?
Yeah, so blue whales are completely awesome. They are the biggest animal that has ever lived on Earth, ever. So bigger than the biggest dinosaurs, bigger than the megalodon, all those kinds of things. So they are about 30 meters long maximum. Usually they're a bit smaller than that. And that's about 3 double-decker buses end to end. They're also really heavy, so they weigh the equivalent of about 20 elephants or about 30 hippos, if you can imagine how much that weighs. So it's a really big animals, and we find them in oceans sort of all over the world.
We had a question come in from Josh, age 9, who was asking how long whales live for. Do we know?
Yeah, so we don't have a great idea what the maximum age is, but the oldest ones we've found, blue whales, are about 70 years old. And the way we find that is really cool. So, you have wax in your ears. So blue whales and most big whales keep that wax for their whole lives, and they kind of lay down layers every year, like tree rings. And so you can count them and work out how old the whale was.
Wow, that is impressive. What do blue whales eat? Because they have a very specific diet, don't they?
Yeah, it's quite strange because given that they're the biggest animal on Earth, you'd think they'd eat something pretty big, but actually they eat these things, which are pictured here. So these are called krill. So they're usually about 2 centimeters long, so pretty small, but the whales eat lots and lots and lots of them. So they can eat about 40 million of these a day. And probably my favorite fact about these is you can see they're a bit pinky colored and they're sort of kind of pinky brown, which means that you can tell if it's a blue whale poos that you found, because blue whale poo is always kind of pinky brown in color.
That's a brilliant fact. That's my favorite so far. We've had a question, Natalie, from Amelia, Henry, and Thomas, and many more people apparently want to know how long whales can stay underwater for.
Oh, that's a good one. So I think it
Yeah.
tends to vary because it depends on the kind of whale. So some whales can stay underwater for hours, really, really impressive diving capacity. But for most of them, at least an hour, which is pretty cool.
That is really, really impressive. um, is there anything that we don't know about blue whales? Things that are still a bit mysterious?
Yeah, I mean, they're very rare creatures, and they're very shy. So there's lots of things about their behavior and their song and how they communicate that we don't understand. But really, the big thing that we really don't know is why they're still endangered, because they've been protected since the 60s, but the numbers are still pretty low. So they've only reached about 10% of the population that they would have had before hunting started. And so trying to understand what it is that's going on that means that they're not recovering as well as other whale species is something that's really important.
Absolutely. And what about Hope, our whale? How did she come to be at the museum in the first place?
Yeah, so the story of Hope is quite an interesting one because we've got lots of information about what happened to her after she died. So in 1891, so over 100 years ago, there's a record of a blue whale swimming quite fast up the waters between Ireland and the UK. And unfortunately, she then met with what's called a sandbank. So the water looks quite deep, but there's actually sand underneath. And so she accidentally landed on that when she was swimming and got stuck. And so this picture shows what happened there. Unfortunately, because they're really big animals, they find it very difficult to move themselves out of these situations. And the local people couldn't move her either. So unfortunately, she died at that point. But the good thing for the museum is somebody recognized this was quite a rare specimen and so contacted the museum. And so the museum actually bought her skeleton at that point. So we've had her since she died, which means we got all of the bones, including the little ones, which are a bit easier to miss. And so after that, she was brought to the museum. We didn't actually have anywhere to put her back then. So she went into one of our many storehouses where we've got our other sort of 80 million specimens we don't have space for in the collection on display. And she stayed there until the 1930s when they built the Whale Hall, which is now called the Mammal Hall. And so you can see here is a picture of her. She was the first whale to be put in there. So they put her together and then they put her up into the ceiling. I love this picture because of the amazing health and safety.
Oh, yeah.
They're wearing the flat caps and the aprons rather than hard hats that we'd have today. And so then they winched her up into the ceiling and she was there from the 1930s until 2015.
That picture is brilliant. Things are definitely a little bit different today, aren't they? How much work was it to actually take her down and then raise her into Hintze Hall?
So this picture is the whale hall where she was, so the mammal hall. So if you've been to the museum, you might have actually seen her. She's, like I said, she's been up there since the 1930s. So taking her down from there and getting her into Hintze Hall was a massive challenge. It took a really long time. And so particularly things like moving her skull. So the skull is obviously the biggest bone in the animal kingdom because it's the biggest animal. It can be about 6 meters long. And so they had to actually take the skull out the window because we couldn't fit it through the door, which was quite fun. We also had to do some prep work. So the conservation team did a lot of dusting. So blue whales and whales in general are often very dusty. So the reason that people used to hunt them partly was for their oil, which people used to put in lamps so that they could see. But the oil continues to come out of the bones of the whale for hundreds of years after they've died, and that kind of attracts all this dust. So we had to dust off tons of dust. That looks very satisfying as a job, I think. So we do dust Hope quite a lot. We also had to repair bits of her, so where things had kind of fallen off, so where we'd sort of lost bits and pieces over the years that she'd been up there. Yeah, and then sort of hoisting her up into the ceiling into that really beautiful pose was quite a task.
I love that image with all the dust. One of my favourite stories from that time was that we kept some of the dust and we analysed it. I don't know if that's true or not. I hope it is.
Oh yeah, we're a museum. We keep everything.
Yeah, what are we going to do all this dust? Science. It's brilliant. Taking her down gave us a really good opportunity to look closely at her bones. But it wasn't her bones or her dust that you were interested in, Natalie, was it? It was something else. It was her baleen. What exactly is baleen?
Yeah, so this is a picture of some of Hope's baleen. So because we got her from when she stranded, we actually have all of her baleen in a great big box in the storage. And so baleen is what big whales like blue whales, minke whales, humpback whales have instead of teeth. So instead of teeth, they have these plates that hang down from the upper jaw, sort of all lined up next to each other. In a blue whale, it could be about 300 of these. And basically, they are made out of a material called keratin, which is the same as our fingernails and our hair. So you can actually see in the mouth, this is a humpback whale, and you can see it's really hairy. So the way that these big whales feed is they take a big gulp of water with food in it, and then they close their mouths, so the hairy bits are sort of at the bottom, and then they can force the water out with their tongues through these hairy bits, through the baleen, and then keep the food and then swallow that down. And so that's the way that these big whales are feeding. And so we were looking at Hope's baleen for those kinds of reasons.
That's very cool. Hope's baleen looks a little different to the humpback, though. Do different species of whales have different baleen?
Yeah, totally. So blue whales, as you can see, have this black coloured baleen, and it's usually about 1 metre long. But you'll have seen in that picture of the humpback whale, they have white baleen, and so do minke whales. And it's often a little bit shorter than the baleen that we see in the blue whale. So it might only be 10 centimetres long or so.
We've got a question that's coming from Miles, age 7. He's asking how big whales' teeth are. How big is because different whales have, some whales have teeth, some whales have baleen. How big are they?
Yeah, so we have different kinds of whales. So we have baleen whales, which they have teeth when they're babies in their mum's stomachs, and then when then they get sort of reabsorbed, and then they grow this baleen. And so it depends on the species how long that is. So blue whales about 1 metre. Bowhead whales, which are the ones with the sort of funny upside down mouths, they can be up to 3-4 metres long, really, really big bits. In terms of teeth, so we have toothed whales. And they will have, some kind of teeth, not huge teeth usually. I mean, things like killer whales, so orca, they're actually dolphins, but their teeth can be about this big.
That's pretty impressive. And why is the whale's baleen interesting? What can we find out from it?
So I'm going to take a little step to the side here and explain about something called stable isotope ratios. And so I'll try and keep this fairly simple, partly because this is not my expertise. This is my collaborator. But basically, in the world, so everything in the world is made up of atoms, and these atoms are in different kinds of elements. So in animals and plants, we have lots and lots of these carbon atoms, which make up sort of the proteins that build our bodies. And in carbon, sort of naturally in the world, we get 2 different types. So we get heavy carbon and we get light carbon. And there are different combinations of the heavy and light depending on where you are in the world. So in some places, like in this sort of made up example here, in Norway, we might have lots of the light carbon and only a bit of the heavy carbon. And in Greece, we might have sort of a more even ratio. So we might have even more heavy carbon in Greece. And so we're able to use this information to work out where things came from. So the way this might work is if I was to go to Norway and eat some fish, then that fish would have in its sort of proteins in the meat, it would have that ratio of carbon that's sort of typical of Norway. And then I would put that into my materials when I was building things. So when I was growing my hair or growing my nails, so growing these things made of keratin, I would use that carbon, which has this sort of particular combination of these heavy and light ones, and that will be how I build new bits of my fingernails. And so the great thing about fingernails and hair and also baleen is that it stays exactly the same from whenever we lay it down. So in this example on the screen here, if we look at a fingernail, so the bit that's closest to your finger, that's the newest material. So I might have, this might reflect things I was eating maybe last week or the week before, whereas at the end of my nail is the older bit, and that's the stuff that I was maybe eating a month ago or maybe 2 months ago, depending on how quickly my nails grow. And so if I was to take samples from the different bits of my nail and look at those ratios, so look at the amount of heavy and light carbon, I'd be able to work out where the food I was eating had come from and get some kind of idea of where I'd been.
That's incredible. So we could trace where you've been throughout time. So yeah, it's like CSI almost.
Exactly, exactly. So you might be familiar with this if you've seen any programs like CSI, where they're trying to find out where the victim or the murderer might have come from, and they take the hair and they take fingernails, and they'll actually look at these isotopes and try and work out where people have come from. So basically, we're doing the exact same thing, but with whales. I should say it's not as accurate as it is on TV, so we can't say that we were, eating Cheerios in, off the A1 last week, but we could say you were somewhere in Northern Europe. And we can also use this to work out where sort of ancient humans might have been coming from, where they might have been migrating and what they were eating as well. It's really cool science.
That's incredible. So you obviously been analysing Hope's baleen. What has that been able to tell us? What have you been able to find out?
Yeah, so we took that baleen and we look through the kind of the whole meter long of it. So, and you can see actually in this picture where we've taken the samples from the baleen to look at those isotope ratios. And so unfortunately, just like our fingernails kind of wear away at the ends, and so does our hair, so does baleen. So we don't have the full history of Hope's life in her baleen. It's about 7 years. So we think she was about 15 when she died. So we've got the last 7 years, so the second half of her life is kind of recorded. And so we're able to match that up to what things look like in the oceans to get an idea of where she was moving and kind of what she was doing in those last 7 years. And so the results, I'll show them on here on this lovely GIF, which is working, which is exciting. We've got what we're calling them 3 phases, and so this GIF will keep looping, but I'll explain them sort of slowly as we go through. So in phase 1, we can see that she was mostly spending time in these sort of warm areas around sort of the Azores, Cape Verde, that kind of area. And so what we think is going on there is she was quite young still, and we think she might have still been a juvenile, so it's a young adult whale. Maybe she wasn't quite old enough to go into the colder waters yet, or maybe she just liked staying in these sort of safe, warm waters. So that's what we see for phase 1 for a couple of years. After that, she starts going up and down, as you can see in the GIF now. So she's going up to the north and coming down to kind of around sort of the coast of Ireland, that sort of area. And this is a really typical pattern that we see in lots of these big whales that feed on things like krill. And so the reason that they do this is because obviously they need lots and lots of food. And up in those sort of really cold areas, it's also the same in the Antarctic, but we're just going to talk about whales going north and south. So up in the Arctic, we have these things called upwellings, so big currents of water. And that brings up lots of food and nutrients from the ground, which makes them all come up into the water. Then the krill can eat those. So you get loads of krill, and then there's plenty of food for the blue whale to eat. And so you find that a lot of these big whales in the summertime will move north into these cold waters, eat lots of food. And then when it gets too cold, so in the winter, when the sea freezes over and they can't stay there anymore, they then move down further south. So sometimes sort of off the coast of Ireland, there's a little population of blue whales there, and they spend the winters sort of in that area before moving back up north again. And so the really interesting phase is phase 3. And in that phase, we don't really know entirely what's going on. It seems like she's moved south again. So she's in those really warm waters, but there's not much food, but it's quite pleasant, obviously, a bit of a holiday maybe. And there's something really weird going on in her baleen in the isotope record. And so that was something really interesting that we wanted to work out.
So can we give any guesses as to what this weird, what was the cause of this weird behavior?
Yeah, so what we think is going on, and the reason we get these funny results, is we think that she had a baby, which is awesome. I know. So we have a number of different lines of evidence, which we won't go into right now. But basically, what it looks like is she got pregnant. moved south, gave birth to the calf in the warm waters, and then raised the baby. So fed it lots of milk. So usually what happens is they feed the babies for about 10 months. And after that, they leave them behind, and the baby can look after itself, and they never actually see each other again. So they don't look after the baby beyond those 10 months. Now, unfortunately, what we think happened was then after having the baby and raising it, she then, as she was moving north again to feed, that's when she accidentally stranded herself and died, which is very sad. But what's really cool, and I think quite the happy ending to this story, is that if she did have a calf, then it's possible some of her ancestors are still floating around in the oceans today, and one day we might even find some of them.
Oh, I love that idea that there are relatives of hope swimming about out there. Hopefully one day we'll find them. We've got loads of questions coming in, Natalie, so I'll just go through a few of them. Many people are asking how many babies blue whales can have in their lifetime.
So they usually have like one every couple of years, it seems. And this is something we still don't know a huge amount about. So if they live until they're about 60 or 70 and they're having one every couple of years, then they could have up to sort of 30 babies. I think it would probably depend on how much food they were getting and how healthy they were as to whether they were able to have babies that often.
So Hope is obviously just one specimen, but she can tell us about blue whales generally. Is that right?
Yeah, so obviously it's always tricky when we've only got one to look at, but we have started looking at some of the other specimens too. And we also find that what Hope is doing in terms of movement is really similar to what whales do today. So ones that we've tagged and kind of followed. And this is really interesting. And it might explain partly why they're not doing so well. If they're still doing the same thing that they were doing over 100 years ago, then maybe that's why they're not coping that well with humans, because there's lots of humans using those waters and causing lots of disturbance.
Unfortunately, yes. We've got quite a few people asking about how whales communicate, and also asking how does whale song travel through water? Tricky question.
Yeah, so whales, lots of different kinds of whales will communicate in different ways. So everyone's really quite familiar with things like dolphins, and they use this very high-pitched sound. They use echolocation, so it's very similar to things like bats. Whereas things like blue whales, they use very deep sounds, so sort of the opposite. So the kind of sound that you can sort of feel vibrating in your bones, sort of the same kind of thing as if you go on an aeroplane, the really loud noises as the aeroplanes kind of take off, sort of that vibrational type thing. And because it's vibrations, they can actually travel really, really far through the water. Because if you think about it, water does wobble. And so the animals are able to sort of take in those sounds. So that's how we think it travels. And it travels miles and miles and miles. It's much, much better than anything we've invented for things. In terms of blue whales, we still don't know a huge amount about their communication, but they seem to have about 7 or 8 different kinds of songs.
Wow.
And they also, it appears that they might, like other whales, have names, so have ways of identifying each other. So certainly for orcas, for killer whales, we know that they have names, and they also have accents and dialects and things like that. So there's so much more to learn in that area.
That's absolutely brilliant. We had a question asking whether you yourself have ever kind of heard or experienced whale song live.
No, unfortunately, I've never heard a whale singing. I have seen some whales out in the ocean. So one of the sort of almost sad things about being a museum scientist is that most of the time the things I work with are dead. However, I get to see them really close up and really get a really good idea of how big they are and all their different features. Whereas if you go out whale watching, you only see a little bit of the whale from quite a long way away.
We've got a question about the lockdown and whales. Abby and Ned are asking, with less boats in the ocean, because people aren't out and about so much, can whales hear themselves better, possibly?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably something that's really benefiting the whales. So we think particularly with blue whales, noise pollution seems to be a really big problem for them. They really don't like it. They try and avoid noisy things as best they can, and so they're probably having a lovely time at the moment.
Yeah. I imagine, absolutely, like many animals, less people around. Yeah, they're probably having a brilliant time. We've got quite a few people curious to know why they're called blue whales. Has this got to do with the colour they are?
Yeah, so if you look at pictures, they are kind of bluish on the top. One funny thing though is actually the bottom half of the whale will often have little growths on it, which are a little bit yellow. And so back in the day, they used to call them sulfur bottoms, so yellow bottoms whales. So when they were catching them, but they do have a kind of bluey color on the skin, which is why we call them blue whales.
Yeah, they definitely do. They're absolutely beautiful, aren't they? Amazing animals. We've got so many questions coming through. Let me go through. So we've got Amelia asking, and we might have touched on this a little bit earlier, age 10, asking how old Hope is, or how old was she when she died?
So when Hope died, she was 15, we think.
15. Okay. Yeah, we've got Summer asking again. I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, asking why she's called Hope.
So this was something the museum thought would be a good idea. They said because she was a blue whale, and blue whales were the first animals that people from different countries got together to preserve, that calling her Hope was a way of reminding everyone that actually, if we work together as a team, we can actually preserve animals and stop them going extinct.
Absolutely. And a very prominent question people are asking is how many blue whales are left in the world? Do we know?
Yeah, so we have some estimates, so some guesses. We think there's between about 10 and 25,000. So not very many. So like I said, if we're being optimistic, that's about 10% of the numbers that are around in the early 1900s. If we're being less optimistic, it's more like 3%.
So we've definitely got a ways to go in conserving these animals, haven't we?
Yeah.
It's great that we've made that effort, but still a bit of a way to go. We've got a great question that's coming from Sam, aged 8, actually. Did whales ever have legs in the past?
They did, and this is one of the coolest things about whales. We think that whales evolved from something that might be a bit like a hippo. So something that was spending a bit of time in the water and a bit of time on the land. And then through sort of evolutionary time, so the way that natural selection works is you make a tiny little change. And if that means that you survive better and have more babies, then you live and you pass that little change through into your babies and your babies' babies and so on. And so we think that they lost a little bit of legs and became more able to swim, and then so on and so forth. And eventually they became the completely aquatic things that we see today. So some of the really ancient whale fossils, and you can see some really great ones online, still have little tiny legs at the back. And Hope, if you ever go back into the museum or you look at any big whale skeleton, if you look at the back end near the back of the tail, you can see a tiny little bone that's kind of shaped like this. And that's the pelvis. So that's the thing that our legs attach to. So, of course, in whales, they don't have the back legs. They've just got the front flippers. And you can see that over time, it's just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's absolutely teeny. But for some reason, they still haven't quite got rid of them because they're not really doing anything. So that's that's my favorite bone of the whale.
Yeah, and you can absolutely see those in Hope, can't you? Yeah, I remember that well. While we're on the subject of Hope's skeleton, Brody he'd asked, how did we put Hope's skeleton together? Amina would like to know how it's actually fastened to the ceiling and how it's there.
Yeah, so like most of the skeletons that you see in museums, they're sort of held together by it's usually sort of a metal frame. So there's a really nice metal frame that's kind of shaped in that nice way that Hope is kind of curved, and then everything's sort of attached to that metal frame. And often you'll see sort of wires and things going through the bones to kind of stick them together. And then in terms of it being attached to the ceiling, there's various points on the whale where we've attached these big sort of metal connectory things. And then there are these big metal cables which then stretch up into the ceiling. So we had to start her on the floor, and then we moved her up about this much every day, just a little bit at a time, to make sure that it was going to be okay. And so luckily everything's great. The ceiling is holding. So it's a very specialist job that we got some professional people from Canada came in and did that for us.
Yeah, I remember that process well. It was absolutely incredible to see that just inching up ever so slowly. It's absolutely wonderful. We've got some really fantastic questions coming in. I know earlier we spoke a bit about whale poo. So we've got Matthew asking whether whales fart.
They do fart. Oh, they do enormous farts. So there was a very lovely book, if people haven't read it, called Does It Fart, by some friends of ours. And I definitely recommend getting hold of a copy of that if you're interested in animal farts. But whales could do farts which are so big you could fit an entire horse inside the fart. So yeah, a lot of farting.
Yeah, that's impressive. You would imagine blue whale was a pretty impressive fart. We've got, why do whales squirt water out of their backs? This is from Scarlett, aged 5, and Theodore, also aged 5, is asking, how do whales breathe? So those questions are sort of linked.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. So obviously we breathe through our mouths like this, but if we were swimming in the ocean all day, we'd have our faces in the water, which is not a great way of breathing. And so one of the really cool things that's evolved in whales over millions and millions of years is that their nostrils have gone from here to up here. So at the top of their head, that's where their nostrils are. So that's where they breathe in and they breathe out. So the reason that there's water is usually just because they've been underwater, maybe a little bit of water's got in, and maybe there's some on the top of their heads. And so when they breathe out, the water just kind of sprays up into the air. And it's really cool because different whales do that in slightly different ways. They make different shapes. So some do that, some do that, and some do that.
That's brilliant.
You can tell the species of whale just by looking at the shape of that watery spray.
That's absolutely fantastic. And what a brilliant question from Scarlett and Theodore. We've got a great question about fossils. Earlier we talked about the evolution of whales. Do we have any fossils of blue whales, or whales that we think might be related to blue whales?
We've got some really great fossils of some of these whales. So one thing we don't have good fossils of, because it's made of sort of fingernail and hair material, we don't have great fossils of baleen. And so we have to make a little bit of a guess when we find a big whale fossil as to whether it would have had baleen and sort of be related to these big blue whales. So we don't necessarily have fossils of blue whales because they're sort of recent animals, but we do have fossils of their relatives. And there's, you know, several hundred different whale fossils that you can have a look at on the internet, and you can slowly see how they sort of change into the whales that we see today.
It's brilliant. It's an incredible process. We've got tons and tons of questions coming through, so I do apologise if we haven't got to your question yet. We're doing our absolute best, but thank you so much for sending all your brilliant questions in. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We had a question come in from Ms. Hilda. I'm not sure if we're able to answer this one, but she asked whether they found any plastic in Hope at all and they were first looking at her.
So I don't think they looked. So remember, this was over 125 years ago. So this was before plastic was invented. So we weren't really using plastics at that point. So I would suspect probably not. But that's a really good question. And we do think that that's one of the things that might be causing them to still be endangered. They really do struggle with polluted oceans.
Absolutely, it's a big problem for all life in the oceans, unfortunately. But it is something we can do something about. We talked earlier about the how long blue whales live for. Poppy has asked, how old is the oldest blue whale?
So I think the oldest one we've got is probably in its mid-70s at the moment. We don't have ages for many blue whales, actually, which is, again, something that we'd like to know more about. However, if you want the record holder, there's a bowhead whale, so it's a different species, which we think was 211 years old when it died, which is incredible. And the reason we know that is somebody tried to kill it when it was smaller. And so when it finally did die, they found the harpoon, so the thing that they tried to use to kill it, inside the whale, and it had a little mark on it that told you when it was made. And that's how they worked out it was probably that old, which is just crazy.
That's incredible. It's amazing that some species can live that long. I know there's species of shark that live for a very, very long time, like the Greenland shark. But that's brilliant. I didn't know that about whales. Oh no, so we've got a great question from Isabel. Does anything eat blue whales?
Oh, good question. So nothing really eats the big ones, so the adults. However, the babies can be eaten often by killer whales. So orcas will sometimes attack the calves, and that's often where predation is going to occur for blue whales. But once you're that big, it's pretty hard for anybody to attack you. They can also swim pretty fast if they want to. So they can swim, I think it's about 30 miles an hour, so 48 kilometers an hour. So they can get away from most things in the sea, apart from, sadly, killer whales.
Oh,
we love killer whales. We should say we love killer whales.
We do love killer whales. We've got a question from Nicole, age 9. Do whales eat humans? They don't, surely, do they?
No. So blue whales in particular are very, very picky eaters. They really only eat a couple of different species of krill. And they also, their throats are only about the size of a beach ball. So it would be pretty hard work for them to, get a human in their mouth and then swallow them down. So no. I think if you accidentally got in the way of a big whale, that might not be great, because it wouldn't be their fault, but they wouldn't be able to tell you were there because you're tiny and they're enormous. But no, they don't regularly go and try and eat people.
We've got a lovely question from Lily and Isla. They're asking, what, Natalie, is your favourite thing about blue whales?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, I don't know. I like all the things. I mean, I like the pink poo. I think that's pretty awesome.
Oh, and we covered this a little bit earlier, I think. Daisy was wondering about Hope's teeth, but she doesn't have teeth, does she? She has baleen. Daisy was asking how many teeth Hope had.
So those baleen plates instead of the teeth, I think we've got about 300 of them in a box.
Wow,
so quite a lot of teeth.
So we know that Hope wasn't fully grown when she died, was she? So she would have got much bigger.
Maybe not much bigger. So actually, she's 25, just over 25 meters long. So actually, exactly the same length as Dippy. If you're sort of trying to compare how, because it's hard when they're up in the sky, or up in the sky, up in the ceiling. No flying whales yet.
No.
And so she might have gotten a little bit bigger, but she was definitely kind of in that kind of mature level. So probably wasn't going to get much bigger than she is.
Yeah, and someone's asking whether we've got her entire skeleton hanging in the museum, or are some bones casts and we've got some kept behind the scenes to study.
No, that whole skeleton is real bone. One of the funny stories is when it was first put up in the 30s, one of the people doing it took the little end bone of the tail and popped it in his pocket and took it home with him. But we even got that back from his relatives who felt bad about it. So that is up there. So every single bone in that skeleton is a real bone. There are some bits that have been repaired, but that's all real bones. So rather than working with casts for research, we're working with 3D scans. So we have a whole 3D scan of the whale, which we did before we put her up. We don't have the baleen hanging because it's really hard to attach to the top jaw without it looking really messy and kind of unpleasant. So the baleen is all in a box in the storeroom, but other than that, it's all real.
Now, we spoke earlier about the possibility that Hope might have had a baby, and there might be relatives out there. So we've got a school actually asking how long whales are pregnant for.
Yeah, so again, this is a really tricky one because it's hard to know when a whale's pregnant. Unfortunately, nobody gives them a pregnancy test. So
that would be tricky.
Yeah, we have to kind of work that out. So we think it's probably between sort of 8 months and 10 months. That seems to be maybe as long as a year. But so on average, probably around 10 months.
And lots of people now are asking about pregnancy and babies. How big are their babies when they're first born?
Oh, huge.
I'll bet.
So I think there's something like 7 or 8 meters. I'd have to check that. Yeah, sorry everybody. I've not memorized every. I don't know all the facts, but I know where to look for the answers. But yeah, they're big. They're big babies, and they grow really, really quickly as well. The milk that they're being fed is something like 100 times more nutritious than the milk that humans feed their babies. It's just like solid fat, basically.
Wow. So yeah, because they're mammals, aren't they? So they're babies. They feed their babies with milk.
Yeah, exactly.
And Hope, she looked after her baby, was it for about 10 months? Is that pretty typical for whales, or do different species look after their babies for different periods of time?
Yeah, so I think it depends at different periods for different whales. So like grey whales, you'll often see those off when people have sort of documentaries when you're looking off the coast of California, and they stay with their babies for a little bit longer and they kind of move around with them, which is very sweet. Yeah, so I think it varies quite wildly, but it's going to be at least 4 or 5 months in order to make sure that they've got enough of that. They've grown big enough in order to sort of live independently. Obviously, things like orcas, actually, they stay in the group. And so they're often looked after. Weirdly, their grandmothers will look after them as well. So they've got a very similar kind of social system to humans, which is a slightly different one to blue whales, where they just raise the baby and then they leave.
We've got a great question asking, how did we know that Hope was a girl?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question as well. So there was an advantage of having the whole animal. Of course, males and females have different reproductive parts, and so when the people who were taking her apart kind of delved inside, they found those female reproductive organs, so they could tell. So we knew for sure that she was definitely a female from that. But you can also, there's certain features of the bones, so different bits of it, which can give us a pretty good indication as well. But luckily, because we had her when she was still, full of organs, we were actually able to do that from what was inside of her.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it had been a different matter if we just had the bones. Would that be a lot more difficult?
Yeah, it's still possible. There's certain features that you can look at, but it's much easier.
We've got a question from Lottie and Bonnie asking, do they spend most of their life alone, or do blue whales swim in groups at all?
They're mostly on their own. So again, this is something we don't know a huge amount about, because it does look like they kind of, they form groups at certain times. So whether they're actually in a group and interacting with each other, or whether they just are in the same place at the same time, where we're not really sure. But it does seem like they kind of move about independently, as far as we can tell.
Well, a lovely question from Oscar, aged 11. Why do whales jump and leap out of the water?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't think people are 100% sure. So it depends on what species you're talking about. So things like, we'll often see humpbacks doing it, and they call it breaching. And they kind of, I'm now going to do an impression, embarrass myself, and they do that. So there's been some suggestions that maybe it's a social thing, maybe it helps them catch more food, or maybe they're trying to get rid of parasites. So you might have seen that they quite often end up growing like barnacles and things on their backs. So maybe they're trying to get rid of those. And with dolphins, they often will do it just for a laugh. You know, they're very playful. Very social. If you've got YouTube, you should look up spinner dolphins, because they leap out and then they do these little pirouettes before going back in, which is very, very cool.
Yeah, they are brilliant. We've got one question specifically for you, Natalie. And how did you become an expert on whales? Would you call yourself an expert? I'd call you an expert.
I don't know. So I work on lots of different things, and so I have I went to university, and I have a biology degree, and I have a PhD. So I'm a doctor of science, and so but a lot of these things I know some of the kind of the basic science of mammals and things like that, and then I go away and do lots of reading. So if you want to be an expert on whales, probably the best thing to do is just read loads and loads of books and websites and watch TV shows and just find out as much as you can, and then you can be as big an expert as I am.
Brilliant. We're almost running out of time. There was one final question that I particularly wanted to ask you, Natalie, and that was really just why you think it's so important to understand and protect whales like Hope.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think all animals are awesome, and I think we should be working really hard to protect them the best that we can, because it's their planet too. It's not just ours. With big whales, I think they're a really good indication of what's going on in the oceans, because, you know, if you're a tiny little fish, they're really important, but perhaps they can avoid certain pressures and certain problems with humans. Whereas if you're a really big whale, then it's really hard to avoid things like noise pollution, to avoid ships and things like that. And so they're kind of experiencing the stuff that the fish will probably experience if we keep producing more ships and more people in the oceans and things like that. So it's a really good way of understanding, you know, what kinds of things we need to do if we really want to preserve our oceans.
Absolutely, and that's a really wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Natalie. I know we had many more questions than we could possibly answer, so I do apologise to our viewers if we didn't get to answer your question. Natalie, you're going to have to come back, obviously. And
yeah, no, these were absolutely brilliant questions, everybody.
They really are.
Yeah, no, brilliant questions. Thank you.
Well, Natalie, thank you so much. We'll say goodbye to you for now, but we'll see you again soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye. And thank you so much to all of our viewers for watching and for all of your brilliant questions. As I said, I'm sorry we didn't get to go through all of them. There were so many, but do join us again. We are here every week. In fact, we've got another show next week on Tuesday at 12 p.m. We're going to be talking carnivorous plants and a show on Friday at 10:30 as well. So do follow our YouTube channel, and you can get updates on what shows are coming up. Thank you again so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time. But for now, goodbye and take care.